So welcome everyone. This is the last session of today, and it's my pleasure that we have two great speakers today. Unfortunately, we have two, not three. Maybe it's good news, maybe it's bad news, but our third speaker is sick, so he could not make it. And the topic of the session is regulator and HTA updates. And as you can imagine, one of the updates will come from the EMA Working Party. And our first speaker is Kit Roos. And Kit is a professor of biostatistics at the Radboud University Medical Center in Nijmegen. And also he's the chair of the Methodology Working Party at EMA. And he's also an expert, senior expert at Dutch Medicine Evaluation Board. And his research focus is design and analysis of clinical trials with emphasis on innovative designs, rare diseases, and bridging the gap between clinical trials and real-world evidence. He is currently involved as package lead in multiple Horizon Europe funded projects. And his experience includes over 25 years in clinical research in pharmaceutical industry and as well as the academic life sciences. So the floor is yours, Kit.
Yeah, and thanks a lot for the extensive introduction. And happy to share the update. Sounds pretty loud, but if it's not bothering everybody, anybody I will go through. You will see that actually the title on the program is somewhat different compared to my slide, but the bridging will actually come into the presentation. And usual disclaimer there, so not necessarily views of the MEB, the EMA, and actually also not the Radboud UMC, but that's not considered very relevant in this type of presentations. Now, seeing how I can best move the slides without running into technical problems. Both me as well as the Vice Chair, Kristen Castle, have presented the Methodology Working Party. It's introduction and its main task before. I will briefly summarize. So the Methodology Working Party does product-related support. Actually had some of that ongoing while we were at this meeting. Prepare and reviewing and updating guidelines and concept papers. I think we'll address that a bit more. Engaging with stakeholders, like we are doing today, and develop the EMRN, that's the European Management Regulation Network of experts in competence and provide the training and workshops for assessors, both methodological as well as clinical. We are present at 23 members across a range of disciplines, so quite substantially broader than purely statistics. And as an overview, we have a working party of 23 members, but importantly, we have the expert community around that core of methodology working parties. And we're organized by special interest areas. And I do want to highlight this because methodology, the strategic thinking behind getting the methodologies together is very much driven that we think that quite a few of the challenging problems, innovations we see in drug development require collaboration across those expertise. But we also need very, very good individual disciplines. So we have organized this expert community in the different disciplines. And also, to be clear here, to preserve the strength that we had in terms of having a very strong regulatory statistical community. So that's now the special interest area of biostatistics, and Elina already mentioned it. We have some leadership of that community also here, Benjamin, Florian, Elina, Andreas, and they are also overlapping with the position in the Methodology Working Party. So, and you see that 23 sounds small, 200 is of a different magnitude. So we are really getting a large community together. What I will do in terms of update, I will summarize recent guidance and make some remarks on, let's say, content-related highlights or content-related significant choices we made. I will share what's ongoing and what's on the new rolling work plan. So that's a work plan looking ahead 2025 to 2028. It's called rolling because the idea is that every year we will reassess whether we are on the right track. And it might actually, priorities might change, new topics might be there, and topics, but they can't be just piled up. So if there are lots of new topics, others need to disappear, essentially. And the bridging is in the last two parts. So I also will address collaborations across the product lifecycle beyond purely market authorization, and have a kind of, I would say, call for attention, call for action on interactions that I think we can improve. I can't get more recent than this, actually. The reflection paper on establishing efficacy based on single-arm trials, a single-arm trial reflection paper. We've had that in this meeting before, discussed and criticized. It was adopted last Monday, so it's there. It was adopted after public consultation and internal comments. A few highlights there. I think I explained it last time as well, but we really looked at, first there is some level of discomfort, even until today, to actually write guidance on a trial design which is inferior in many, many perspectives. It didn't feel comfortable while doing it, still doesn't feel entirely comfortable, but I think it will be helpful. So we looked at the single-arm trial really as an independent entity, because most of the single-arm trials we see have an original protocol where only the single-arm trial is described. And that's done, and it's submitted to ethics committee. And at the time of submission, we see lots of other stuff happening, external controls to contextualize and being added, but that's not the trial design. So we've really isolated it to the original trial design. And the principle we start with is, you don't arrive there for nothing. We do expect first to consider the standard, a well-controlled clinical, well-controlled randomized trial. And if for some reason that's impossible to do, single-arm trial is an option you can drill down to. That doesn't guarantee it provides useful results. So lots of the guidance is about first going through the hurdle. Apparently we are not able to do the trial. It needs to have a very strong motivation, but that doesn't mean that the single-arm trial will give you useful results. So the guidance is really, can I actually have a single-arm trial deliver useful results if it can't be avoided? So that's very much how the guidelines should be written. We did some updates following the public consultation and also our internal thinking progress. So we did implement the estimate framework more rigorously throughout the document, which also helped articulate a couple of issues more precisely than we did in the original paper. And that's related to the single-arm trial. What's the counterfactual you have in mind, but also something what would look obvious and easy, the definition of treatment initiation. Actually, it's not so easy. So you could say, well, following the estimate frame and treatment initiation is that informed consent. If you look at a single-arm trial, that's not always the best choice. So let's say implementing the estimate framework gave us the opportunity to be a lot more precise on some of these issues. One thing you will not read explicitly in the guideline, but what did happen, of course, there was quite a bit of discussion from an ACA perspective on the potential limited usefulness of single-arm trials. So we've actually had a discussion with representatives of the methodology subgroup of the coordination group to look at the guideline and what we could do or include to actually also look forward to the single-arm trial that we are now assessing for marketing authorization will necessarily also be used as evidence for the next decision in line, and actually reflecting some of that within the reflection paper was felt useful as well. So it's made clear that other research questions may not be answered by, even if you fulfill all the requirements and the principles in the present reflection paper, you're not there yet, might not help you for the next step. And highlighting some of the things that need to be done also with the perspective from a patient perspective in terms of endpoint choice, as well as the level of information that needs to be there on covariates and your patients, being aware that the single-arm trial will also be used for indirect comparisons for HTA decision-making. So this is kind of the highlights of things that changed, but it's there now. And if you read it and you follow it, you will actually, my guess is actually the number of single-arm trials should reduce because it's actually quite restrictive what's there, although you might not immediately think so. Second one I wanted to mention, also adopted last Monday, that's the reflection paper on the use of artificial intelligence throughout the life cycle of medicines, delineating general principles. And what I think a few I will not drill down the entire guidance. I would promote reading it because I think actually it's very important for statisticians. It's based on a risk-based approach. We are pretty precise what we mean by risk. So that's the regulatory risk, because also the AI Act got into force, also has a risk-based approach and defines medicine as a particular area for AI application. So we very much focus on the regulatory and the decision-making risk and AI application drug development. It's only one of the first elements that we have in looking at artificial intelligence in the context of AI and medicines regulation. I will come back to our nearest future plans in the next item. And this was done by a multidisciplinary drafting group. So we have a few AI experts, not that many, but particularly the statisticians and the pharmacometricians were quite important to have there and getting the principles right. And I was wondering, I will not ask for a hands up, but I'm not too sure that there is the same level of involvement of statisticians in the activities on AI within companies. But I would really want to promote that to happen because I think it's going to be hugely important. Also interesting on this one, we are not only covering human medicines for this particular reflection paper. So this is also on the list for adoption for the veterinary medicines. Then moving to real world data. One pre-remark here, because I think guidance development, we are increasingly aware not only of the connection between the marketing authorization decision-making and the next decision that also needs to be made in terms of reimbursement to actually have treatments reaching patients. We're also quite aware we are not the only ones developing guidelines across the globe. So for real-world data, we made an overall decision to really see what's already out there, both in terms of regulatory guidance, but also academic guidance. And particularly focus on areas where we think there are gaps, rather than having our own European view on matters. So the things that we are prioritizing for guidelines here is much more driven by filling gaps than having a unique European perspective, also to not complicate global drug development unnecessarily. The one that I'm also there. I'm hoping that actually everybody has seen it, but it'll be the reflection paper on the use of real-world data and non-interventional studies to generate real-world evidence. Public consultation closed. Also here, I will not ask for hands off, but I really would. I'm going to assume most of you have seen that, and if not, there's an additional challenge there because I think you should. Also, this was multidisciplinary, so across pharmacoepidemiology, real-world data experts, but also here, statistics is a very crucial part. Basic principles there is that it's structured along the research question. So it's not the study or the design, but very much as a structuring element has the research question there. And it recognizes that even if it's observational messy data, we sometimes have a causal research question. And we kind of hide that in observational studies, saying, well, we can't go beyond association. But that's, in many cases, that's not the real question. The real question is causal. You do want to know whether something causes a particular adverse effect from observational data. And we make clear that actually you should state that, and then subsequently your approach of the observational study should reflect that. And I think both the estimate framework as well as elements from the causal inference framework are part of this guidance. So here you will see the target trial approach as one of the structuring elements to get that connection good between the research question and the actual, maybe already the choice of the data source and the subsequent design of the analysis. Yeah, if you've not read it and did not comment, yeah, your chance is passed. Okay, this is the highlights very recently. What do we have ongoing? So already working on it. Bayesian statistics, we think there's a strong need, and we know it's also element of the discussions on the ICHE 20, but I think we need a more general approach of Bayesian statistics across drug developments. We're at the stage of a concept paper, and you can expect before we really get cracking on the content to have a stakeholder workshop to get input also from you on what we need to what and how we need to tackle there. A bit further, and I will come back to that in a minute, our platform trials reflection paper. That's more advanced, as well as the multiplicity guideline, and not surprisingly, we see a connection between the two. So those two really are being co-developed because we think one of the key issues in platform trials is how do we want to think about multiplicity issues. So the idea is that that's covered in the platform trials for that part, but then the multiplicity guide should actually certainly not conflict, but actually treat a different problem than the problem in platform trials. And Q&A on small population, including indirect comparison, because there's a need for, amongst others, pediatric development, where it's happening quite a bit. We need some further refinement there. And what Elina presented this morning on the SMPC, also there, public consultation closed. There I know some of you have actually commented. But I'm actually quite happy because we now have the assignment from the CHMP as a methodology working party. So across the disciplines have a more comprehensive overall view on how we think the SMPC should be shaped in terms of what data and evidence do we present. And actually what Elina indicated this morning, relevant and reliable, those will be very much guiding principles with which we will actually provide our comments on the current version. In a small setting, I shared my initial ideas on how quickly this would go, but I will not do that publicly because I think that we are depending on lots of others as well here. Then it's not isolated. I see three things here. So the platform, multiplicity, and the SMC guidance. I think they actually also move us towards a few more fundamental issues where I think we might actually need methodology development. So the discussion on type 1 error control, as I have not included but it's an instrument for controlling risk and regulatory decision-making. I think we understand that very, very well. And it's also needed at the individual trial level. For me, it's always a design element, actually, but that's not necessarily shared with everybody. It's a bit more challenging, maybe not even statistically. It's very easy to, in terms of formula, think about type 1 error across trials, but in terms of decision-making and control of errors, it's much more challenging. And if not sure, but if you've actually made that observation, but there is actually very, very little guidance on how we make decisions and how you prepare for decisions, taking into account what we kind of frame as totality of evidence. Most of the guidance we have is at the individual trial level. And I think some of the things that we see happening push us to think more on broader basis of evidence. And I think the platform trials are somewhere in between. So we need fundamental thinking here to get this right. It's not similarly, but a little bit differently, it's through the SMPC. So there the principle of relevance and reliability holds for the SMPC, and it's very good, at least in my mind, it's very helpful that I kind of distinguish two things quite strictly, and that's justifying the regulatory decision we made. That happens in the EPAR. And communication, the product characteristics, that's actually in the title, in the SMPC. And those are also, in my view, statistically very different topics. And if you want to frame it statistically, the first relies a bit more on hypothesis testing. The second is an estimation exercise. And that's not the same. And we should not actually confuse the two. So I think this is something that, and then we have to deal in all kinds of nasty details on actually how to do that. But that will drive the discussion. And it's related to also how we think about evidence and reliability and errors in decision making. Because essentially the SMPC is after we've approved the draft. Actually, it's part of the approval decision if you are really precise. It's in the same meeting and you decide. So the actual decision is not yes, no, the actual decision is the label. But you have already proven efficacy. No worry about type 1 error control, that's there. And so everything you present in the SMPC is conditional on the fact that you've agreed this is an efficacious drug. We don't always agree on this type of insight yet in the entire regulatory world, but I think this is the type of thinking we will be challenging a bit, working on the SMPC. That's ongoing. Now I move to the work plan, and also there we had let's say, a fairly detailed stakeholder interaction not too long ago in June for the entire methodology working party work plan, with an open invitation for input across lots of stakeholders. I will not say it was biased, but it was fairly dominated by actually statistical feedback. So across the disciplines, most of the, let's say, suggestions and thinking came from a statistical perspective. I will not summarize everything, but this was roughly the agenda. So there was more feedback, but these were the highlights we actually discussed at the stakeholder meeting in June. And kind of challenging now. And we did listen, did not necessarily take on board everything, but it did influence to some extent order of priority and where to include some of the suggestions that were made. So the work plan. This is selected for a statistical audience, but a couple of the topics that I think are relevant are which we prioritize. So this is to start in 2025 in the current work plan. And this is for an open consultation to a limited extent. That's still open actually but for the targeted stakeholder organizations. We'll be discussing it next week. So until the end of the month, it's open. But this is our current thinking. We do think we need to address external controls with high priority, given the range of different design options that are considered that somehow rely on or aim to leverage, that's probably the better way of phrasing it, external controls. And I'm expecting that we will make a very clear distinction between external control by design, so prospectively planned, and then I'm also kind of practical thing, so that's in the protocol that you submit to an ethical committee. And preferably prospective data collection, because that solves another problem, actually having the data and the quality standards for the external control at the same level that you have in your randomized or in your trial part. And we will distinguish that from the very much more messy problem, and that's the post hoc addition of external evidence or control or data to either a single arm trial, but the same would actually hold for hybrid type of designs, where you augment the control group or rely on external data to strengthen the evidence on the treatment effect. But we think this is given the feedback, but also our own assessment, this is of high priority. The second one also is not on a totally guideline, but a Q&A on the new development we see in terms of synthetic covariates. We discussed the Procova proposal last year. That kind of also triggered this thinking. We need to address any new issues that we see that are not covered in our current guidance to cope with this. And a few which might be a little bit outside your usual scope is a Q&A on pharmacology-based PK modeling or complex modeling and model-informed bioequivalence and biosimilarity. I'm highlighting them because I'm actually also there expect that we will do that multidisciplinary and would actually hope that the same thing happens at the company side. That statisticians are involved there. Looking ahead a bit further, so lower priority, but still within to start 2026, 2027. Q&A on the use of synthetic data and regulatory submissions. I will have to actually think I've said it here, but synthetic data is, of course, a bit of a strange term. But it's there, just like real-world evidence is there. So we need to address it. Use of modeling and simulation in bioequivalence, and a concept paper, and we touched upon it a bit earlier, on the use of the credibility matrix framework for decision making. So there, I think we are moving towards thinking beyond an individual trial and the strength of evidence to shaping thinking about uncertainty at another level, and including uncertainties that are related to the increasingly complex modeling we use throughout the different data sources and trial designs. And also preliminary concept paper on pragmatic trials. We've put it on the agenda, not because we are seeing it a lot. So that's kind of, this could actually also be different over time. Because I think our principle is we are open, but we are not seeing it. So we are not, in that sense, addressing a very urgent issue that we need to get our heads around pragmatic trials. They're not being proposed that much. Also, more biostatistics. Yeah, we need to take into account the RCHE 20. This is anticipating when we are ready for that. So, of course, we will adapt to RCHE 20. And one of the problems that was also suggested in the stakeholder workshop is guidance of aligning estimate attributes across different trials in the context of a meta-analysis. I think we need to do it. I don't think this is an easy problem. I think we already have big problems, I think, in fully getting a grip on estimates within a trial. As we noticed from the discussion. But on the other hand, it's also unavoidable. Because meta-analysis are being done, they are being done a lot, they provide very relevant information, so we also can't ignore the fact that estimates exist if we do a meta-analysis across trials, and that they might differ between trials. Okay, so this is a view on our plans, and as I mentioned, there is still some time left to comment on the plan for the organizations we approached. So we'll also be curious to see the responses. But then you have kind of a grasp where we are, and certainly do highlight if you think we miss important priorities. There's still opportunity to do so. On a different note, so this is real practical guideline development. I think I can state that the awareness compared to years ago on the fact that we have a process that doesn't stop at marketing authorization is also there in the market authorization decision making. So the awareness that, well, we have a very important responsibility to make that first decision. Can we allow this treatment to enter the market, become available? But that doesn't mean it reaches the patients, while also that's actually the ultimate goal for market authorization, for the CHMP, for treatments that actually have benefits for patients, that they actually reach patients. So that awareness is, I think, a lot larger than it used to be. What we've done for methodology is actually install a coordination mechanism across the methodology working party, CTCG, the Clinical Trial Coordination Group, and the HTA coordination subgroup on methodology to get aligned around guideline development, being kind of a small experience with the single-arm trial, but we actually want to make sure, because the same guidelines or the same trials will actually face guidelines from both the market authorization perspective as the HTA perspective. So we don't necessarily need the same ones. We have a different decision to take. But aligning there, knowing upfront, more proactive what we're doing there, and making sure that we do not complicate design of trials, execution of trials, I think, is a shared urgency for us. So that's why we established the coordination group there. It's also good to be aware that we are from a regulatory market association perspective in a very positive position. We have we have an expert community of 200 people. We have lots of people that actually are able to work on guidelines. The HTA side is not there yet. So it's good to be aware that there's a real issue in terms of capacity building to do a good job there. But essentially there also, I think we can actually help by coordinating and working together. And one of the things that's happening actually this year is a workshop jointly from an HTA and market authorization perspective on uncertainty across the entire process. So actually understanding how we deal with the uncertainty at the market authorization decision-making as well as the other part. And around concrete case studies. So we have an initial webinar to share the initial thinking, and we will have a very more intensive in-depth workshop on concrete case studies where that were perceived as problematic, and to increase the understanding across the two decision-making steps, but also improve if we can. So I think lots of good things are happening there. So this is Europe. We've had the methodology working party now. We're getting, it's 2.5 years now after we initially started. Getting all the methodologies together. Fairly recently, the FDA has created as a cross-division entity, the Quantitative Medicine Center of Excellence, and that's fairly recent. I think it's roughly this summer. And there we've also got in touch and say, well, we kind of share the same philosophy of getting those methodologies together to improve the assessment, but also essentially improve drug developments. So we've started there also to at least to communicate. So we have first meetings and follow-ups there to learn from both sides of the oceans how to do so. And as a final collaboration is that quite a few of us, chairs, members of the working party, also EMA, we are getting more involved than we used to in collaborative efforts in research projects. I also mentioned my roles there. These are 3 projects in rare diseases, Eramet, Invents, and Realized. The latter one is IHI and was just approved. We'll start in January. But the involvement there is also, I think, getting into a new phase of collaboration rather than the invitee EMA to the advisory board. So we are setting a next step there as well, that we actually want to make sure that we collaboratively build a good environment. And in this case, for rare diseases, the list is not complete, so there are more projects there where we see that happening. So that's kind of the bridging I see, and I think that's also why I really like this meeting. It will provide platforms for open communication, but it also will actually lead to concrete results that leverage the input from essentially all sides. I think this completes my update. And now I'm going to go to a call for, let's say a call for, to start with a call for reflection, but maybe a call for action. Kind of a high level sense I already have for longer. We see a lot of innovation in terms of methodology happening. And we all, I think everybody who comes up with an innovation, nice new design, genuinely believes it's better. But that doesn't mean, if we are innovators like everybody else, that's actually not true in many cases. Most innovations essentially, when put to practice, are not so successful or don't do the job that we expected. And I think let's starting with the traditional way of how scientific advice questions are put to us. Does the agency or whoever find the following acceptable? Which is not a scientific discussion. That's essentially a yes or no answer. But what it also does is kind of put the final responsibility of what is a proper evidentiary standard at the regulator side. And I truly think this is a shared responsibility to patients and society. So I think we are looking for that, to make sure that that becomes a shared responsibility. Everybody should be nervous. if we don't provide solid evidence that underlies treatments, which of course are beneficial, but I've not seen many treatments which do not also cause harm, and they certainly cost money. So I think kind of moving to seeing that it's a shared responsibility, I think that's one message. The other one, the pace we see, is also challenging. RCH E9 was built on years and years and years and years of practical experience. The estimate framework was the starting sign for building experience. Totally different ball game, I would say. So we introduced something that we actually did not fully understand in its practical consequences. But we need to deal with that because there are opportunities to improve. So we can't say, well, let's wait for every innovation until we've built up enough practical experience, because then we lose very valuable time and opportunities. So I think I would like to foster the right innovations, but I would kind of call that might need somewhat of a different conversation than we typically have. And I've called it, it needs an honest conversation. Because I get the sense sometimes, let's say, imagine us at two sides of the table for a scientific advice. It's a bit of a caricature, but there is one side that's selling an idea, does it in the best possible way, and kind of hopes that not all the caveats are discovered by the other side of the table, because it's nice to go ahead. While I'm also crucially aware that particularly the statisticians, in most cases, both sides of the table, the statistician on one and the other statistician, let's say on the company side, we might weigh it differently, but we are all both very much aware of where we run the risk of arriving at a lower standard of evidence, or run the risk of, let's say, a nice design operationally. It might actually turn out not such a nice design. And I think if you, in such a setting where we see lots of new things offered, ask regulators to come up with a kind of general answer. Is this acceptable? You force the regulator to be conservative. Because if the question is very general and we kind of hide some of the real difficult issues that we all know that are there, you will get a fairly conservative answer. Because we kind of have to anticipate the things that we don't know. So I would would love to see the conversation getting a little bit more open, a little bit more vulnerable on the things that we both know are challenging in new designs or in using external controls. Actually, my guess is all your statisticians kind of have an itch that there are problems there we can very difficultly tell. Let's share that we have the same problem, but see whether the context justifies that we take a bit of risk here. And that's really we, and not only the regulator, not kind of saying, well, they've said it's acceptable, so we are fine, we're good to go. No, we're good to go if it's in the interest of patients. So it's kind of a call for, let's see whether we can move that discussion a bit. And I'm saying it here because I think actually statisticians might, my guess is among the groups that are discussing, the statisticians are closest to some of those issues and have a difficult time in convincing in their, my guess is you've been in a situation where you go home and you say, I told you so. That's well, let's discuss it while we are together. That would be huge. And I truly believe that if we would be able to shift that a little bit, it's easier to get innovative than if we don't. So that's kind of my call for thinking. And I'll close here.
Thank you very much, Kit. Yeah. And you provided great update on what's going on at the Methodology Working Party. I don't know if there are any burning questions before we move on to the next speaker. I see one hand at the very back.
Thanks. So thanks for all the updates. Following on from the session we had this morning about patients and drug development, I believe the EMA are going to be putting out a guidance about patient engagement, and I was wondering if you had an update on that.
Yes, I know, but I'm not fully, let's say, familiar enough to give a detailed update. But it's both patient engagement, but also there is work ongoing in terms of patient-relevant outcomes and ensuring that that's adequately included in drug development. So it's beyond only engagement. It's also efforts to ensure that we have outcomes there that matter to patients. But I do not have sufficient detail. Sorry.
Thank you for that. I see that the rolling plan is very extensive. I didn't see anything along the lines of like Project Optimus from FDA about optimizing the dosing of certain medications, like for example in oncology. Maybe I missed it. Maybe you had already done that in the past. Maybe it's, but I don't see anything recent, let's say, along those same lines and thinking in phase 1. Thank you.
A good question. Two hats here in my mind. So in terms of developing guidance or reflections on that issue, at least from a methodology working party perspective, that's not ongoing. On the other hand, there are regulatory research projects ongoing, both in national agencies and at European level, to look at that problem. So the phase 1. So it's not ignored, but it's not included at this point in time in guideline thinking.
Another question. Well, at conferences, we still see a lot of sessions regarding estimates, and we discover that there are a lot of open questions. I was wondering if there's interest to supplement the guidance with a question answer document.
Yeah, also given the discussions we had in this meeting, I would almost say again, we've not thought about it, but it's something I would chew on, but because I think we need to do something there. Because there is a disconnect and sharing the issues and being very concrete on what are we expecting. I'm not sure whether the Q&A is an answer. What is happening is that estimates are entering clinical, let's say for particular domains, are entering clinical guidelines. And there it gets more concrete for a particular indication area. So I'm wondering whether it's a Q&A we should have from a methodological endpoint, or whether it's more important to get it into clinical guidance, because one of the challenges that was mentioned yesterday, the clinicians are still not involved sufficiently. So I see your point, but reflecting on it, I think I would give priority of getting it right in the clinical, on the clinical side first.
Oh, thanks a lot. I think we have a lot of burning questions. Sorry, but I need to continue with the second speaker for now, and we will continue with the questions later. Thanks a lot. So our second speaker is Gregory Levin. He is an associate director for the statistical science and policy in the Office of Biostatistics in FDA, Center for Drug Evaluation and Research. He received a PhD in biostatistics from the University of Washington in 2012. And Greg has a lot of experience supporting drug review across a wide range of therapeutic areas, and he is engaged in policy and guidance development in many areas, such as adaptive design, master protocols, benefit risk, and evaluation of effectiveness. The floor is yours, Greg.
Thanks very much for the introduction and the opportunity to speak today. And thanks to Kit for the really nice talk. I learned a lot. And perhaps outside of this session, we should talk about opportunities to collaborate on some of these areas that I think we're both talking about in our presentations. So yeah, I'm going to provide some brief updates on statistical focused topics from the US FDA Center for Drug Evaluation and Research. Next slide, please. So I'm going to kind of introduce the center and the office where I work, and then provide some brief updates on a handful of statistical topics that are highlighted here: covariate adjustment, real-world evidence, master protocols, AI and machine learning, diversity in clinical trials, and adaptive and complex innovative designs. And then I'll just kind of mention some other topics of interest where we have ongoing work or future work might be a priority. Next slide. So just as a way of introduction, I work at the Food and Drug Administration in the United States, and our mission is to protect and promote public health in the US by regulating human and veterinary drugs, biologic products, medical devices, food, tobacco, and other kinds of products. There's several centers at FDA that are in charge of regulation of different types of products. I work at CDER, so we regulate drugs. And so I will be talking about, recent efforts in the drug space. Some of these are in collaboration with other centers. For example, we often work quite closely with statisticians in CBER, the Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research. But sometimes there are also different efforts across the different centers. So I work in the Office of Biostatistics, which provides statistical leadership, expertise, and advice to support the CDER mission. And some of the things that statisticians in OB do, we review sponsor submissions throughout drug development programs. We provide research, support for internal and external programs, and help develop and disseminate policy and guidance. And it's the policy and guidance space where I'm most involved in my position. If you're interested in learning more about our office's approach to kind of developing statistical policy and guidance and including opportunities for external engagement and collaboration, there was an article recently published in the spring 2024 American Statistical Association Biopharmaceutical Report that kind of describes that approach. Our office has over 250 statisticians, so it's quite a big group of statisticians providing statistical support for CDER. Next slide. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cover some statistical topics that I think are important and for which there are some relevant recent or ongoing policy or guidance efforts. So this is by no means meant to be in a comprehensive list of important topics. It's focusing on ones where, we had some recent efforts or ongoing efforts where I can share some relevant information for you all. And for each topic, I'm certainly not going to do any of these topics justice. What I'm going to try to do is just briefly summarize some of the recent or ongoing policy or guidance efforts. And I provide, many, many links throughout this presentation to resources where you can read and learn more. So it's really just to make everyone aware of some of those, guidances or programs that have been developed and to provide resources for people to take a closer look at after the talk. And then I'll have about a slide on each topic where I just highlight a few high-level principles related to the topic that I find particularly notable or important. Definitely not a comprehensive list, just more focusing on some principles that I think are important, perhaps because they're often overlooked or sometimes misunderstood. But, just focusing on a few select principles for each topic. Next slide. So just diving right in. So, one area where we've had policy and guidance development is in the space of covariate adjustment. So we had a draft guidance published and received public comments, and then reviewed those public comments, made edits, and published a final FDA guidance on covariate adjustment in May of last year. This guidance reflects FDA's current recommendations on adjusting for covariates in the statistical analysis of randomized clinical trials and drug development programs. The link to the guidance is provided here. Next slide. Just to highlight a few of the many principles that are emphasized in this guidance, I think an overarching message that we wanted to send is that pre-specified adjustment for baseline covariates in the primary analysis is acceptable. And in fact, it's generally recommended because it can improve precision and power. Now, the guidance does say that an unadjusted analysis, a pre-specified unadjusted analysis would also be acceptable. But we really wanted to send the message that covariate adjustment is a reasonable and acceptable approach from an FDA perspective. The guidance also emphasizes that adjustment for covariates that are anticipated to be most prognostic of the outcome is recommended. So in general, it's recommended to select those covariates that are expected to be most prognostic. But if for some reason there's an adjustment for covariates that are not prognostic, or even covariates that are strongly associated with each other, the covariate adjustment is still acceptable. It still provides valid inference on the treatment effect, which is what we're ultimately interested in. Another important principle is that covariate adjustment in a linear model provides valid inference on the average treatment effect, even if the model is misspecified and does not accurately capture the relationships with the outcome. So this is one of the main reasons why we determined and have stated that covariate adjustment is an acceptable approach, because the inference is valid even if the relationship between the covariates and the outcome is not perfectly captured by the model. A couple other related points is a recommendation to generally use robust standard error methods, for example, like the Huber-White sandwich-based standard errors, which is particularly important if you have an unequal randomization ratio to ensure valid estimates of uncertainty. And similarly, to use a standard error computation that accounts for stratified randomization if there is stratified randomization in the trial. And then finally, and this is a topic where you have to kind of go to the guidance and the cited references to learn more, but the guidance emphasizes that covariate adjustment in a nonlinear model is more complicated. It involves additional considerations. And a key consideration that I think has become discussed more in the literature in recent years is the determination of whether there's an interest in a conditional or an unconditional treatment effect. And there's a variety of considerations that follow depending on the interest. Next slide. Second topic to provide some updates on is real-world evidence. So FDA created an RWE program in 2018 for evaluating the potential use of real-world evidence to support a new indication for an approved drug or to satisfy post-approval study requirements. There's a link to a document that describes this program and a framework. And as part of that program, FDA has published many guidances related to real-world data and real-world evidence. This is not a comprehensive list of those guidances. There's a link at the bottom of this slide that provides more information and has links to additional guidances, but I just pulled out a few guidances that I think are particularly notable. The first one is on real-world data and assessing electronic health records and medical claims data to support regulatory decision-making. So it's focused on electronic health records and medical claims data. The second one is focused on assessing registries. The third one is on considerations for the use of real-world data and real-world evidence to support regulatory decision-making. So it's more on kind of, it provides definitions and concepts and a framework for evaluating the use of RWE to support decision-making. And then the last one, a very important guidance, and perhaps something to be discussing in the future as there are efforts, it sounds like in Europe to discuss concept papers on external controls, is this recently published guidance on the design and conduct of externally controlled trials. Next slide. So just a few notable principles. I think just one overarching thing to keep in mind is that, real-world data can be leveraged and or real-world evidence can be generated for many different purposes in the context of many different kinds of study design. So just to kind of give a few examples to illustrate the wide range of the potential uses of real-world data and real-world evidence, like this, it can be used and often has been used in the past before these terms even came into existence to inform trial design. So looking at registries or natural history studies or other, electronic medical data or claims data to try to determine appropriate populations for enrollment, or to try to inform the appropriate endpoint selection, or to try to inform the feasibility of a study and sample size and power calculations. This is a basic and important use of real-world data and real-world evidence. It can also be used within a randomized controlled trial. So for example, where you have randomization to a treatment or a comparator, and then the outcomes are collected through electronic health records or claims data. Can be used in an externally controlled trial, or also can be used within an observational, non-interventional study. And the considerations for the appropriate use of RWD and RWE, depend very heavily on the context of use. So we really need to kind of drill down on what the context of use is. And I think, similar to a comment that Kit made in his presentation, I do, feel strongly that that randomization remains the recommended gold standard, the gold standard for generating reliable information on drug safety and effectiveness. Unfortunately, I think there's, RWE is often considered to be synonymous with non-randomized studies, and I don't think that's the case. As I mentioned, RWE can play a really important role in randomized trials, and I think we're starting to see a bit more consideration of the incorporation of pragmatic elements to increase efficiency, to increase patient centricity, to increase generalizability by leveraging RWE in the context of a randomized trial. FDA has recently created the CDER Center for Clinical Trial Innovation, or C3TI. There's a link to this to learn more about C3TI here. C3TI has initiated a number of demonstration projects, and one of those is on streamlined trials embedded into clinical practice, which I think, is hopefully where we can gain some more experience on these trials that, incorporate more pragmatic elements, and I think, can play an important role in the future. Next slide. Okay, so moving on to master protocols. So FDA published a draft guidance on master protocols in December of 2023. The guidance provides recommendations on master protocols, but the primary focus is really on umbrella and platform trials. So trials evaluating multiple drugs for a single disease with a focus on confirmatory late-stage trials. We did receive, many public comments on the draft guidance, and they're currently under review. One of the notable recurring sets of comments focus on, there was a lot of interest expressed in the guidance expanding its scope to provide more information, more recommendations related to basket trials. So we're currently considering that. Next slide. So just a few of the notable principles in this guidance, the first being that the primary analysis should generally include only concurrent controls unless there's a compelling justification provided to support the use of non-concurrent controls because of the potential risk of bias that can be induced when leveraging non-concurrent control data. The guidance also emphasizes the extra care that's needed in the context of master protocols to preserve the integrity of randomized comparisons. So just as a couple examples, oftentimes there can be different drug-specific eligibility criteria. So for example, perhaps there needs to be some exclusions for patients with renal impairment for a specific drug due to toxicity concerns, but not for other drugs that are evaluated under the master protocol. And when there are differences in eligibility criteria, the analyses for any given drug should utilize only those control subjects who were eligible for and could have been assigned to the drug to protect the integrity of the randomized comparisons. Similarly, there can be designs where the randomization ratio changes over time. So even, not necessarily an adaptive randomization scheme. It could be a fixed randomization scheme where the scheme depends on the number of drugs that are evaluated in the trial. So there's no response to the randomization ratio is not responding to accumulating information. It's not a response adaptive or covariate adaptive randomization scheme. It just depends on how many drugs are being evaluated. So you can see something like a ratio of the square root of k to 1, where there are k active drugs in the platform trial. And if this is the case, then the comparisons should account for, the change in the randomization ratio over time, for example, with stratification or inverse probability weighting. The guidance also emphasizes that different blinding strategies may be considered depending on the context. So for example, it talks a lot about the pros and cons of partial blinding strategies and how to implement those. And then importantly, and I think, one of the things that I think Kit mentioned was an active discussion is about multiplicity. And in the draft guidance on master protocols, we do not generally recommend multiplicity adjustments to strongly control type 1 error across the multiple comparisons of the different drugs. We do continue to emphasize the importance of controlling for multiple comparisons for each individual drug, for example, for multiple endpoints or multiple doses or multiple subpopulations that are being evaluated, but not across the different drugs. Next slide. So in terms of AI and ML, FDA released a discussion paper in 2023, and then a more targeted discussion paper on the use of MI and of AI in drug manufacturing, also in 2023. There's some links here to those documents. Next slide. So similar to what I said about RWE, there's really a broad range of current and potential uses of AI and ML in drug development and regulation. And these range from drug discovery, non-clinical research, clinical study design and analysis, safety surveillance, manufacturing, regulatory use, for example, identifying sites for inspection. There are some overarching really important considerations, including but not limited to the importance of human governance, the need for transparency and reproducibility and validity. But the regulatory risk and the risks to public health, and correspondingly the expected evidence that we would want to see to support their use is going to depend very much on the context of use. So just to kind of give a couple examples to illustrate how things can depend heavily on the context of use, these are a couple areas where we've seen AI at least discussed for possible use. The first being as in terms of adjustment for baseline prognostic scores that are derived from external data using artificial intelligence. So adjustment as a covariate in a linear model to improve precision and power. And our perspective on this is, essentially the same as I think what was shared by EMA on PROCOVA, prognostic covariate adjustment. And that is that if the model to derive the score is fully pre-specified, then essentially this is just an example of covariate adjustment. It's just an example of ANCOVA, and it's a reasonable approach. In contrast, if there's a comparison of single-arm trial results to, for example, predicted counterfactual outcomes on placebo based on a model using AI derived from external data, then there's a much higher risk in terms of inference on the treatment effect and regulatory decision-making, because the validity of the inference depends very much so on the model performance. And so the risks here are different, and therefore the rationale and the evidence basis would be much different to support such uses. Next slide. So in terms of diversity in clinical trials, there was a final FDA guidance on enhancing diversity of clinical trial populations published in November 2020. And then just a couple months ago, there was a draft FDA guidance published on diversity action plans to improve enrollments of participants from underrepresented populations. Next slide. So a few of the kind of notable principles from my perspective that appear in these guidances are listed here. First, there's just the general overarching recommendation that trials should enroll diverse populations that accurately reflect the patients who are likely to take the drug if it's approved. And the underlying rationale for this is that it can help ensure the generalizability of the results to clinical practice. And it also can facilitate the assessment of differences in safety and effectiveness by relevant patient characteristics. So the guidances kind of highlight some examples of approaches that can be used by sponsors to enhance diversity. These include basically going through each exclusion criterion in a draft clinical trial protocol, and one by one trying to remove those unless they're absolutely necessary to assure patient safety. It can also be helpful to utilize inclusive enrollment practices with respect to age, sex, race, and ethnicity. to make trial participation less burdensome so that, you know, many different types of patients in many different circumstances are able to participate, to ensure that clinical trial sites include locations with diverse populations. And then the most recent, you know, effort and guidance that I mentioned is related to sponsor diversity action plans. So these are plans that would actually include specific enrollment goals for different groups, provide a rationale for those goals, for example, to try to match the epidemiology of the patient population that would be expected to use the drug. And then also to describe steps that are going to be taken to achieve those goals. So the idea is that writing all this down and would ensure accountability and would help enhance diversity. And these diversity action plans are actually going to be required in the United States for phase 3 studies for which enrollment begins after 180 days from publication of a final action plan guidance. So we need to get public comments on this guidance and then publish a final guidance. But then after that happens, 180 days later, these are gonna start to be required. Next slide. The next topic is adaptive designs and complex innovative designs. So there was an FDA guidance on adaptive designs published back in 2019. We also published a guidance on interacting with FDA on complex innovative designs in 2020. There's an ongoing complex innovative design meeting program, which has been going for many years now and offers the opportunity for increased interaction with sponsors on proposed CIDs. So sponsors get 2 additional meetings, and FDA, we gain the ability to disclose information about these trials, even if before the drug is approved or if the drug is not approved, through disclosure agreements so that we can share learnings about the CIDs. There are 5 case studies that are described on the CID website. I provide a link to that here. And then, as was mentioned earlier, there's ongoing work on ICH E20, an international guideline for adaptive designs. And within FDA, we also have ongoing work on a Bayesian guidance and have a commitment to publish that guidance by around this time next year. Next slide. So some of the notable principles on adaptive designs and CIDs. So the FDA guidance on adaptive designs kind of emphasizes a variety of key principles that include having adequate trial planning, controlling the chance of erroneous conclusions, ensuring that there's reliable estimation of treatment effects, and maintaining trial integrity. And there's just a couple examples of the, you know, kinds of things that help follow those principles. The first is pre-specification of the anticipated adaptation rule. Even if it's not necessary for valid inference, there are other really important reasons for such pre-specification. And then utilizing existing methods to estimate treatment effects that account for the adaptive design. For example, a variety of methods exist in the group sequential space, and these adjusted estimates can greatly reduce bias and improve mean squared error and should be more readily used. And then in terms of CID proposals, the interacting guidance from FDA really emphasizes the importance of early interaction and detailed documentation and careful thinking. And this includes having a discussion of the rationale for the design, a detailed evaluation of operating characteristics, including a simulation report if applicable. And when there are Bayesian approaches being proposed, really having a clear, detailed description and justification of the choice of prior distribution and decision criteria. And we anticipate providing much more detailed guidance on Bayesian approaches, as I mentioned, next year. Next slide. So the last thing I just wanted to mention is just some other topics of interest. These are things that either I think is very important, or we have kind of ongoing discussions within my office, or maybe are considering or initiating work on some policy and guidance efforts. One of these is what was, discussed at a session yesterday, which is, kind of thinking through some principles for the selection of appropriate primary estimands in late phase trials. Another one is the prevention and handling of missing data. So, I think there's been a lot of good work on this space. I think ICH E9R1 helped kind of clarify what we mean by missing data and provided some important guidance on sensitivity analysis. But I still think there's probably room for improvement in preventing missing data and, more methodological aspects of the approaches to handle missing data and the approaches to sensitivity analyses, thinking through, approaches like tipping point analyses, which I find quite valuable. So this is an area where we have some active work in our office. A really important area, which, is certainly a cross-disciplinary space, but I think statisticians have a lot to offer, is the evaluation of biomarkers as surrogate endpoints. A super challenging area where I don't think we have a lot of good guidance, and I think there's an important need, given the importance of surrogate endpoints in drug development. Evaluating heterogeneity of treatment effects, so, including subgroup analysis. There's an FDA impact story on the potential value of shrinkage estimation in evaluating heterogeneity of treatment effects that I provided a link to here. I think this is an important area where we could, improve some of the methods and approaches. Statistical considerations in rare disease settings, so including like regulatory flexibility and how we can do that from a statistical perspective, what we can contribute, but then also like the evaluation of surrogates is really important in this space. Those are just a couple topics that come to mind. And then something that's just also important to me is kind of statistical engagement and considerations in safety assessment. So at least within our office, there's been kind of more of a culture in the past where statisticians contribute heavily to efficacy, but not so much to safety. And I think there's a lot of value that we can bring to the table in the planning stage and also in the analysis and interpretation stage. And this includes things like thinking through how information should be ascertained in the trial on an important safety outcome, like the use of routine open-ended adverse event reporting versus having more targeted questions, versus collecting additional data or having an independent adjudication process. The choice of metric for quantifying risks, so the use of crude proportions versus alternative approaches like Kaplan-Meier estimates or incidence rates or time to events analyses. The importance of stratification by trial when there are pooled or integrated analyses of data from multiple trial. Even just the basic importance of including estimates of uncertainty around comparisons for safety. So including confidence intervals or other methods or other approaches to quantify uncertainty. And then, I'm not using the Esteban language here. This is really an Esteban question, but in the safety space, it's often referred to as on-study versus on-treatment analyses. So this is kind of related to the handling of treatment discontinuation as an intercurrent event in the analysis of safety. So those are just a few kind of other topics of interest that I thought I would highlight as things where we're working a bit, and I'm hoping there can be more work by the community and some collaboration on improving, statistical engagement and just, the statistical perspectives on this. I think that might be my last slide. Yeah, thanks very much. And I'm looking forward to any questions or discussion.
Thank you, Greg. That was really interesting. Lots of homework, lots of stuff I have to read when I get back to the office tomorrow. So we have time for questions. And as you ask your questions, maybe you think back to where we started this morning as well, and the fact that we had the updates from China, and maybe that reflects some questions that you might want to ask. So we have both Kit and Greg available, so we'll take questions. I see one here in the room already.
Okay, Pierre Mancini, Sanofi. Thank you for the two very inspiring talk. My question is for Gregory Levin from FDA. I really, appreciated your comments around pragmatic trials and some of the initiatives that are currently ongoing at FDA and in the US to kind of accelerate that. I would be curious, because we know pragmatic trial is a concept that has been, published by Schwartz and Lelouch, I think, something like that. I mean, several decades ago, right? So would be curious to see from the FDA perspective and maybe from also the EMA perspective, what have been the hurdles and the pain points that are making that we don't see that, you know, being used that often. So while I'm like you convinced that it could be a very powerful tool. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a good question. You know, I don't know is the kind of the short answer. I mean, I think Kip mentioned maybe we haven't seen too many of these, and I would probably share that perspective that we haven't seen a lot. We've seen some. I mean, I can think a few offhand, some, you know, some publicly available and some not. Some more in the post-marketing space, like a post-marketing safety trial. I think there's been a bit more willingness to experiment there. So I don't know, you know, necessarily. There might be more of a question for some sponsor folks to weigh in on why, if these are discussed and then abandoned, or if they receive negative regulatory feedback. I don't know what has prevented it, but I think one of the things, at least we're hoping with, I mentioned that demonstration project, which is really trying to, kind of motivate the use and then provide a space for open discussion and learning and experiences being shared so that we can identify any pain points if there are, and perhaps figure out where they're going to be, most beneficial in the future. So that's, that's kind of all I can say on that important question.
Thank you. Another question?
Andreas Brückner, Novartis. In 2022, the FDA presented FDA meta queries at the Duke Magnoli's workshop. Has there been an update? Are there plans how to give access to updated versions to the public?
You're talking about the FMQs? Sorry, I just...
Yes, the FMQs. Has there been any update in that direction?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I know there's ongoing work, but I don't have a concrete answer to your question because I'm not sure. If I find anything more about that, maybe I can share any publicly available information with the organizers and they can circulate it, but I don't have an answer to that right now.
Uli Burger, I have a question for you, Kit. I really liked what you said about scientific advice meetings with industry, and that industry is sometimes quite defensive, and that there is a role for statisticians in the industry to play a bigger role and to get the discussion to a more constructive place. But I was wondering if there's not also a role for the statistician on the health authority side to help and to play a more constructive role, because from what I sense, often it's sort of a bit an undervalued role on both sides.
Yeah, the brief answer is yes.
At least something.
Yeah. No, but I think we are, and the somewhat more extensive answers, I think we together need to seek a different balance to cope with the innovation that we both acknowledge, but against the background that the standards of having very, very good evidence for our patients is a common threat, a common goal we need. So I think on both sides, because also we bring with us the way we've acted before.
But I can really see a role for us in bridging between the two sides when we work together on that.
I'm also inclined to give an answer that was to the previous question on pragmatic trials. So, and in addition to I think Greg's answer, because I think our thinking is pretty much in line, maybe we should also not think in terms of a dichotomy between pragmatic trials and other trials, but consider pragmatic elements in trials. And that I think that gives ground for experimentation. So actually getting used to it, but I think there is also a real advantage there to make trials a little bit easier. But also we get a better grip on the concerns. The concerns, I think you could also imagine, are about if you collect the data in a real world setting without the usual standards that we impose in the clinical trial, there is uncertainty there, but we might not need to worry that much, but we would have to build experience to see what's happening. So for me, it's maybe not, it's a pragmatic trial or not, but which pragmatic elements are going to be helpful overall to include in trials. So that it's not a dichotomy in my mind.
Emmanuel?
So I have a request for elaboration for each of you, Kit and Greg. I'm going to ask both, and then you take the order you want. So Kit, could you please elaborate a bit more on what you alluded to on the reflection on the label and the content of the label that you mentioned would be part of the working plan? And Greg, could you share more on what are the underlying questions that would be part of your first other topic that you had, which is the choice of the primary estimate? What would be the directions that you would investigate in this? Thank you.
We take it in the order that you asked the questions, probably. That's a very broad question. Expand on the reflections. I'm going to dodge the question a bit because I think this is a serious effort we are going to make, but we still have to make it. So we really are at the point, actually next week, we will have a meeting with the Methodology Working Party where we will define in more detail the way we want to look at the SMPC, let's say, review and our input there. So I can see you soliciting my reflection, but this should actually not only be my reflections. I think we need to do some very serious work here because it's not, let's say, it's a fairly important document and it's a type of discussion we've not had before in any detail. So I really would like to have the discussion internally first before expanding too much on my reflections. Not that I don't have them, but...
So yeah, similarly, that is a very broad and challenging question, but an important one. I mean, to be honest, I haven't thought it through yet entirely, and I think there's a lot of space for how that might play out. Just brainstorming. I mean, a few things that I think might, would be important to be part of that effort. The first, and probably important to start with this, is some of the questions that came up yesterday, which are certainly not statistical only questions. They're broader drug development questions, scientific questions about what are we trying to achieve with clinical trials. Is the goal, more for understanding whether a drug is active, or is the goal more for providing information relevant to treatment decisions that are made in clinical practice and understanding potential impact on public health? And can those be the same questions in some settings? How close are they? How different are they? Those are broad questions that need to involve many different stakeholders at many different levels of organizations and outside organizations. So, but I think that's an important part of that. And then more targeted questions that, maybe have more statistical focus. I think the presentation by Rob and Frank brought up like the trade-offs between, answering the right question and reliability of the methods for estimating that estimand. I think, digging into those trade-offs a little bit more. And then one other topic that is kind of important to me is sensitivity analysis. I think we often do sensitivity analysis for treatment policy type questions. They're fairly well understood sensitivity analyses. Unfortunately, I don't necessarily see the same rigor of sensitivity analysis when people are interested in hypothetical questions. And the one big difference there is when you're interested in hypothetical questions, you can't really reduce the amount of missing data. So the reliance on the sensitivity analysis is even more critical. And I feel like if we were rigorous there and we looked for reliable evidence across the plausible space of assumptions when we're looking at hypotheticals, we may not end up in a very good place at the end of that in terms of inference. And so that could feed into the trade-offs conversation. I think that's another area. Those would be essentially lines of questioning that might lead us down the road of developing some principles that I think would help. Those are a few just initial thoughts.
Thank you. We have another question in the room.
Yeah, well, thank you for very informative presentations. I have a question on diversity, one to Kit and one to Greg. To Kit, are there considerations ongoing on diversity? If I didn't miss it, you seem not to have mentioned it. And to Greg, where you brought up this important aspect of representing the target patient population, which we see in clinical practice, who gets treated with a drug. So for multi-regional trials, there will be differences across the regions. And in the last draft of the guidance, it was mentioned that the US population should be represented across the regions. Maybe that's a misunderstanding. As for example, if half of your patients are from Asia in the clinical trial, you won't have Black patients where but you need, if you want to represent, let's say 15% Blacks, so you need to over-recruit somewhere.
Again, with the order of the questions, the 2 levels of response. It's not so heterogeneity in the way that Greg indicated. The initiative also had 2 levels. It's kind of making sure that the diversity in clinical trials is at a higher level, that we actually have a principle of those action plan that Greg was asking for. And we'll be introducing and on the US side of increasing diversity in trials, and that's one. The other point that he highlighted is there is something to do methodologically on how we assess and address heterogeneity within trials. That's more of a methodological question, and we don't have a specific methodological effort at this point in time to address the second part. If I look at the European level in terms of increasing diversity in trials, there are efforts underlying the new pharma legislation and also, let's say, regulatory thinking, but that is a point of attention also for the European side. I don't have all the details there, but methodologically, so the methodological tackling of heterogeneity in trials, we don't have a specific guideline of thinking at this point in time, and that's not because it's not an important problem, but there's so much you can do. I think that's also something I hope Greg and I will exchange. That holds for everybody in the regulatory field. So I think increasing collaboration and not duplicating thinking is also probably very important.
Thanks for the question. So I wasn't sure if I completely followed it all, and I don't recall the kind of specific language in the 2 guidances related to multi-regional trials, but just to reflect on that topic for a moment, I can certainly see in some cases like a multi-regional design, enhancing diversity, and in other cases I could see the tension that there could be multi-regional designs where, heavy enrollment in specific regions might lead to, insufficient diversity with respect to certain patient characteristics. And so there's a tension there, and I could see, especially as we move forward and we consider these diversity action plans where there are going to be goals set. And, we at FDA, our primary mission is the United States and reflecting the characteristics of patients in the United States. So I could certainly see scenarios where there needs to be, targeted enrollment of certain patient populations in a multi-regional trial to ensure that you have sufficient diversity with respect to certain characteristics, but that's probably as much as I have to say on that topic, I guess, at this stage.
Okay. Thank you. Well, thank you to everyone who's raised questions. We are out of time. It's been a very good and long day. Thank you very much to our speakers today and throughout the day. And before you leave, a final reminder that we start at 9 o'clock tomorrow. So see you all back here then.
Can I just add two little things? When you don't come back to